For as long as I can remember, my mom, Clara, resented my existence. I wasn't just her teenage mistake. I was her punishment, a constant reminder of a life she could have had without me. She never missed an opportunity to remind me, either with words, with glares, or on the worst days with her hands. My childhood was a blur of loneliness punctuated by the moments I spent with my grandparents, Evelyn and George. They were my only source of kindness, love, and stability. Evelyn and George were everything Clara wasn't. They made sure I ate, kept warm in the winter, and had someone to talk to when I felt invisible. They were the ones who encouraged me to study, who told me I was smart, capable, and worth something. Whenever Clara's fury became too much, their house was my refuge. But even their love had limits. They were old, tired, and unable to shield me from Clara's relentless bitterness. When Evelyn and George passed away within a year of each other, I thought my world had ended. At 17, I was already trying to hold the pieces of my life together, and losing them felt like losing the only family I had. But their lawyer reached out with a surprise. They'd left me their house. The news stunned me. Clara? She was furious. She wasted no time letting me know how she felt about their decision. "You don't even know how to take care of a house," she snapped as she paced the apartment kitchen, a cigarette burning between her fingers. "You're a kid. What the hell were they thinking?" "They were thinking about me," I said, my voice trembling. I wasn't used to standing up to her, but something about that house gave me courage. They wanted me to have a future. A future? You're 17. You can't even pay your own bills. You think you're just going to waltz in there, and why do you even care, Mom? I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's not like you've ever been interested in my future before." Her face twisted in anger. "Don't you dare talk to me like that, you ungrateful little..." She stopped herself, glaring at me. "You wouldn't have a future if it weren't for me. I could have gotten rid of you, you know. But no, I kept you. I gave up everything for you, and this is how you repay me." I didn't respond. Arguing with Clara was like trying to stop a hurricane with an umbrella. I let her rant until she got bored and stormed off. But that night, I overheard her talking to Greg, her latest boyfriend, in the living room. "She's going to screw it all up," Clara hissed. "That house should have gone to someone responsible. Someone who knows what they're doing." "You mean you," Greg said, laughing. "Damn right me," she shot back. "I'm her mother. It should have been mine." The bitterness in her voice chilled me. Evelyn and George had given me a gift, a chance to break free from Clara's grasp, and I wasn't going to let her take it away. The house wasn't much to look at, a modest 2-bedroom with creaky wooden floors and an overgrown yard, but to me, it was everything. When I turned 18, I moved in. Packing up my belongings and leaving Clara's cramped apartment felt like shedding a second skin. I was finally free. The first night in my new home, I slept on an air mattress in the living room, surrounded by boxes. The walls were bare and the kitchen appliances were ancient, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. Of course, Clara didn't stay away for long. Just a few weeks after I'd settled in, she showed up unannounced. I heard the doorbell and peeked through the window to see her standing on the porch, Greg behind her with a smug grin on his face. Clara's hand rested on her pregnant belly, and she was holding a large tote bag, like she was planning to stay a while. When I opened the door, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me into the house. Sure. "Come in, I guess," I muttered, closing the door. Clara looked around the living room with a critical eye. "This place is a mess," she said, wrinkling her nose. "You're not even keeping it up. I don't know why they thought you could handle this." "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She placed a hand on her hip, her tone turning sweet. Too sweet. "Greg and I were talking, and we think it would make more sense if we moved in here with you. You've got all this space, and it's just you living here. I mean, look at me." She gestured to her pregnant belly, like she was unveiling a masterpiece. "I need a real home for the baby. You can stay in the basement, or maybe you could go live with your dad for a while. He's got that big house, right?" Her audacity left me speechless. "You're joking," I finally said. "I'm not joking," she replied, her voice growing sharper. "This is what families do. We help each other. I sacrificed everything for you, and now it's your turn to step up. You owe me this." I stared at her, my mind racing. This was my home, my only home, and she was trying to take it from me. The years of neglect, the cruel words, the constant manipulation, it all came rushing back in a wave of anger. I don't owe you anything, I said, my voice trembling. Clara's face twisted in rage. You selfish little brat, she spat. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? You think you're better than me just because you have this stupid house? Let me tell you something. You wouldn't have anything if it weren't for me. Greg snickered from the doorway, and Clara shot him a glare before turning back to me.
Fine.
If you don't want to live with us, then go stay with your father. He owes you more than I do. Her words stung, but I refused to back down.
No, Mom.
This is my house. If you want a home so badly, go find your own. For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Then Clara let out a bitter laugh. You're going to regret this, she said, her voice low and venomous. You'll see. She stormed out, Greg following behind her with a smirk. I stood in the empty living room, my heart pounding. I didn't know what Clara would do next, but I knew one thing for certain. The battle for my freedom was far from over. I've done everything for you, Clara said, her voice dripping with indignation. You think you'd even be standing here if it weren't for me? She was planted firmly in the doorway, her arms crossed so tightly across her chest it was like she was physically holding in her anger. Greg leaned against the porch railing behind her, grinning like he'd already won whatever argument she thought she was about to have. The baby bump she flaunted seemed bigger now, and it was clear she was using it as part of her pitch. I'm not asking for much, she continued, her tone shifting into something resembling fake sweetness. You're just one person in this big house. And look at me. I have a family to think about. I'm pregnant, for God's sake. The least you could do is let us live here. You can have the basement. Or maybe you could even stay with your dad for a while. He's got plenty of space. My stomach churned at the suggestion. Living with Daniel wasn't an option. He was a stranger who shared my DNA, not a father. He'd called once on my 16th birthday and forgotten how old I was. Clara knew that, and yet she dangled him like a punishment, a way to back me into a corner. No, I said firmly, my voice steady even though my heart was racing. Clara's mask of sweetness shattered instantly. No? Just like that? You're really going to stand there and tell me no after everything I've done for you? The word everything hung in the air between us, and I felt a bitter laugh bubbling in my throat. Everything? What exactly had she done? I thought of the meals I'd made for myself as a child, the nights I'd spent crying into my pillow while she screamed about how I'd ruined her life, the times I'd stitched my own wounds, both physical and emotional. You mean the bare minimum? I said, unable to stop myself. Feeding me? Keeping me alive? That's not a sacrifice, Mom. That's your job. Her eyes narrowed, and her face flushed red. How dare you talk to me like that? You think you're so high and mighty now, huh? You think this little house makes you better than me? Greg snickered from the porch, and Clara shot him a glare before turning back to me. You owe me this, she hissed. After everything I gave up for you, my youth, my freedom, this is how you repay me? By throwing me out on the street with a baby on the way? The self-pity in her voice made me sick. She wanted me to feel guilty, to feel like I was the villain in her sob story. But I wasn't falling for it. Not this time. This is my house, Mom, I said, stepping into the doorway to block her path. If you need a place to live, find your own. You've got Greg. You've got options. Don't you dare talk to me like that, you little brat, she snapped. Her voice was sharp, but there was something desperate beneath it. You think Greg and I have money lying around for a new place? We're barely making ends meet as it is. And now you're telling me to just figure it out? Yeah, I said, my voice hardening. That's exactly what I'm saying. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the porch under Greg's weight as he shifted his stance. Then Clara let out a bitter laugh. You'll regret this, she said, her voice low and venomous. You're going to regret every word you've said to me today. Greg smirked as he pushed off the railing and started down the porch steps. Let's go, babe, he said. This place isn't worth the hassle. She's just a spoiled little girl playing house. Clara shot me one last glare before turning to follow him, but she stopped halfway down the steps and called over her shoulder. Don't come crying to me when this all falls apart. You think you're so grown up, but you don't have a clue what you're doing. You'll see. I slammed the door before she could say anything else. My hands were trembling as I leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. The confrontation had left me shaken, but also angry. Angrier than I'd ever been. That night, I sat in the middle of the living room, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I thought about everything Clara had said, about the years of manipulation and guilt-tripping that had defined our relationship. She had always been this way, always trying to make me feel like I owed her something. But now, for the first time, I realized I didn't. I didn't owe her my home, my happiness, or my future. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done. Clara was like a storm, chaotic, unpredictable, and impossible to avoid. And I knew that as long as I had something she wanted, she would keep coming back. What I didn't know was just how far she was willing to go to get it. Clara had always been good at making scenes. Her anger wasn't subtle. It was a performance, crafted for maximum effect. When I told her, flatly and without room for argument, if you want a house so bad, Clara, go get your own, she froze for a moment. Then her face twisted into an expression I'd come to know too well, a mix of fury and disbelief, like I had just denied her the most basic right to existence. You selfish little brat, she spat, her voice rising an octave. After everything I've done for you, you're really going to choose a house over your own family's? Greg, leaning casually against the porch railing, let out a low chuckle. His smirk said it all. He was enjoying this. He didn't see me as a threat, just a kid with no backbone who'd eventually cave. I wanted to scream. Family? What family? The one she was building with Greg? The one that had nothing to do with me? For years, I'd been an afterthought in her life, a burden she tolerated only when necessary. Now, she was asking me to give up the one thing that finally felt like mine for a family that didn't include me. I'm not choosing a house over family, I said, my voice shaking but steady. I'm choosing myself for once. And you don't get to guilt me into giving that up. Clara's eyes widened, as if I'd slapped her. Unbelievable, she muttered, shaking her head. Then she turned back to me with a venomous glare. You have no idea how good you've had it. You think you're so special just because my parents decided to spoil you. Let me tell you something, Missy. You're nothing without me. Nothing. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but my chest felt too tight. If I'm nothing, why do you need so much from me? I shot back. For a moment, the air between us was heavy with silence. Then Greg pushed off the railing and clapped his hands together. All right, Clara, enough, he said with a grin. She's made her point. Let's not waste any more time here. Clara stared at me for a long moment, her face a storm of emotions. You'll regret this, she finally said, her voice low and dangerous. When you're sitting here all alone in this big, empty house, don't come crying to me. You don't know what family means, and you never will. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed down the porch steps. Greg followed, throwing me one last smirk over his shoulder. Good luck, kid, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. I slammed the door before they reached the street. My hands were trembling, and my breath came in short gasps. It wasn't just anger. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I knew Clara well enough to know that this wasn't over. She didn't take rejection lightly, and I had just dealt her a big one. For the next few days, I kept expecting her to come back. Every time I heard a car outside or footsteps near the door, my heart leapt into my throat. But she didn't return. At first, I thought maybe she'd given up. Maybe she and Greg had found another solution. But then, a week later, my phone rang. It was Margaret, my paternal grandmother. Hi, sweetheart, she said, her voice warm as always. How are you holding up? I'm fine, I said, though my voice betrayed my exhaustion. Why? Margaret hesitated for a moment. Clara called us, she finally said. My stomach dropped.
What?
Why? She wanted us to talk to you. She said you were being unreasonable and that you're refusing to help her in her time of need. Margaret's tone made it clear she didn't believe a word of it. She even tried to guilt us by saying the baby doesn't deserve to suffer because of your stubbornness. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course she did. Don't worry, Margaret said firmly. We told her we're not getting involved. We know the truth, and we're proud of you for standing your ground. But I don't think she's done, sweetheart. Be careful. Margaret's words stayed with me long after the call ended. Clara wasn't the type to accept defeat. She thrived on chaos, on manipulation, on finding weaknesses and exploiting them. And now, she was desperate. I started to notice small, unsettling things. One evening, I found the gate to my backyard unlatched, even though I was sure I'd locked it. Another time, I spotted Greg's car parked at the end of my street, its engine idling as if he was waiting for something. Part of me wanted to confront them, but another part knew that's exactly what they wanted. Clara would use any reaction as fuel for her narrative, that I was unstable, ungrateful, and incapable of managing my own life. So I stayed quiet. I kept my doors locked, my curtains drawn, and my phone close by at all times. But the tension was unbearable. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder for the next move Clara would make. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit living room, I found myself wondering how long this would go on. How far was Clara willing to go to get what she wanted? And what was I willing to do to stop her? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It was a Wednesday morning when the email came through. I remember because I'd just sat down with my coffee, finally feeling a sliver of peace after weeks of Clara's absence. The subject line was ominous: for your consideration. I opened it, half expecting more insults or demands, but what I found was so much worse. It was 3 full pages of carefully crafted manipulation. Clara had poured her heart out, at least her version of it, detailing how selfish I'd been, how my refusal to help her was ruining her life, and how she was struggling to provide for her growing family. But the kicker came at the end of the email, a series of ultrasound photos attached, each captioned with saccharine phrases like baby's first picture and hope for a brighter future. And then, as if that wasn't enough, there was a link to a GoFundMe titled, "Help a Single Mom Create a Home for Her Family." The description was stomach-turning. In it, Clara painted herself as a struggling, hard-working mother who had been cruelly kicked out by her ungrateful daughter. She talked about how she had sacrificed everything to give me a good life, only to be abandoned in her time of need. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. At first, I was furious. I slammed my laptop shut and paced around the house, muttering curses under my breath. But as the anger simmered, it gave way to something worse: hurt. Not because of the email itself, but because of what came next. Curious, I reopened the link to the GoFundMe and scrolled through the comments. They were full of sympathy and support, names I recognized from family gatherings and childhood memories. "Stay strong, Clara. You're such a good mom. You're doing your best, and that's all that matters." Donated. Sending love and prayers. It wasn't just the comments. People were actually donating. Mutual family members I hadn't spoken to in years were chipping in $20, $50, even $100, all based on her lies. Not one of them had reached out to ask for my side of the story. The betrayal cut deep. These were people who had seen what my childhood was like, who had witnessed Clara's neglect and outbursts. And yet, they were falling for her performance, buying into the idea that she was some kind of victim. By the end of the day, I knew I couldn't let her get away with it. Clara had always controlled the narrative, twisting facts to suit her needs and turning people against me. But this time, I had something she didn't: the truth. I called Margaret and Henry that evening. They had always been my strongest supporters, the ones who saw through Clara's manipulation from the start. When I told them about the email and the GoFundMe, Margaret let out a sharp laugh.
"She's desperate," she said.
"That's what this is, desperation. But you don't have to take it lying down, sweetheart. Tell your side of the story. People need to know the truth." Henry chimed in, his voice steady. "We've got your back. Whatever you need." With their encouragement, I spent the next few hours drafting a post for Facebook. It wasn't easy. Writing it meant reliving some of the worst moments of my life, but I knew it had to be done. The post was long, detailed, and brutally honest. I started with my childhood, painting a clear picture of what life with Clara had been like. The neglect, the verbal abuse, the constant reminder that I was an unwanted mistake. I talked about how Evelyn and George had been my only refuge, and how they had left me the house as a way to give me a future Clara had never cared to provide. Then I laid out everything that had happened since I moved in: the demands, the threats, and finally the GoFundMe. I included screenshots of her email and the GoFundMe description, leaving no room for doubt about her intentions. "I'm not sharing this to seek sympathy," I wrote. "I'm sharing it because I refuse to let Clara manipulate and lie her way into another round of pity and support at my expense. This is the truth, and I'm not going to let her rewrite it." I hit post and sat back, my heart racing. For a moment, there was silence. Then the notifications started rolling in. The response was overwhelming. Friends, extended family, even people I barely knew flooded the comments with support. Many were horrified by what Clara had done. Some apologized for believing her lies, while others condemned her outright. "I had no idea it was this bad," one cousin wrote. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through." "Unbelievable," said another. "She's manipulative as hell." "I'm so glad you spoke up." Within hours, the GoFundMe was taken down. Someone, probably several people, had reported it as fraudulent. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. For once, Clara's lies hadn't worked. But Clara wasn't the type to go down without a fight. The next day, my phone started blowing up with messages from her. "You had no right to post that," one text read. "How dare you air our family business like that? You've humiliated me." She called me at least a dozen times, alternating between sobbing voicemails and furious tirades. "You're destroying me," she said in one. "You're ruining my life. And for what? To make yourself feel better?" I didn't respond. I deleted the voicemails, blocked her number, and turned off my phone. But even with Clara's voice silenced, her words lingered. She had always known how to get under my skin, and this was no exception. As I sat in the quiet of my living room that night, I felt a mix of relief and unease. I had finally stood up for myself in a way I never had before, and it felt good, empowering, even. But I also knew Clara wasn't done. She was a master manipulator, and if this round hadn't worked, she would find another angle, another way to turn the world against me. The reaction to my post was like lighting a fuse on a bomb I didn't know I was holding. Within minutes, notifications flooded my phone, likes, comments, shares. Some people messaged me privately, others wrote their thoughts directly under my post. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in calling Clara out. "Wow, I can't believe she's been doing this to you," one old school friend wrote. "I'm sorry I ever believed her lies," said a second cousin I hadn't seen in years. "You're so brave for speaking out," another comment read. But what stood out the most were the apologies. People who had donated to Clara's GoFundMe or supported her over the years admitted they'd been duped. "I feel sick thinking about how I fell for her manipulation," an aunt wrote. "You deserved better, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Some people took it a step further. By the next morning, Clara's GoFundMe had been flagged and taken down for violating the platform's rules. Seeing that page erased was a small victory, but it came with a heaviness I hadn't anticipated. Clara wasn't just going to let this slide. The first sign of her retaliation came in the form of a furious Facebook post. She didn't tag me. She wasn't that direct, but anyone who knew us could see the thinly veiled references. "Some people think it's okay to drag family through the mud for attention," she wrote. "I've always tried my best, even when the odds were against me. But I guess that's not enough for certain people who think they're better than everyone else. Just remember, what goes around comes around." Within hours, she was commenting under my post, trying to guilt-trip me. "I can't believe you'd do this to me," one comment read. "Do you hate me so much that you'd punish an innocent baby?" I wanted to ignore her, but every time I saw her name pop up, my anger boiled over. She wasn't just trying to defend herself. She was doubling down on her narrative, painting me as a heartless monster who cared more about revenge than family. Some people still bought into it, too. I saw comments like, "Why air dirty laundry like this? Families should handle these things privately," or "This feels like a personal attack." Maybe both sides need to apologize. Both sides? Apologize? I wanted to scream. This wasn't some petty disagreement. This was years of pain and manipulation finally being brought into the light. The support I'd received was overwhelming, but it didn't erase the emotional toll. Seeing everything laid out in black and white, the neglect, the manipulation, the betrayals, left me drained in a way I hadn't expected. It was like ripping open a wound that had barely started to heal. I spent hours reading through the comments and messages, trying to make sense of it all. Margaret and Henry called to check on me, their voices full of concern. "You did the right thing," Margaret said firmly. "Don't let her get to you." But Clara had always known how to get to me. She thrived on chaos, and I was her favorite target. She started leaving voicemails, her tone shifting with each one. Some were angry, full of accusations and insults. Others were tearful, begging me to make things right. The worst ones, though, were cold and calculated. "You think you've won," she said in one message. "You have no idea what you've started. You're not as smart as you think you are, and one day, you'll regret this." The weight of her words settled over me like a dark cloud. For every moment of validation I'd felt after sharing my story, there was an equal moment of doubt. Had I gone too far? Was I becoming the villain in someone else's story, just like she said? One night, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I started questioning whether I'd made a mistake. The post had given me a voice, but it had also unleashed a storm I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But then I thought about all the times I'd stayed silent. All the times Clara had walked all over me because she knew I wouldn't fight back. And I realized that this time, I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was standing up for the kid I used to be, the one who had spent years believing her lies. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. Clara wasn't the type to give up easily, and the fallout from my post was just the beginning of whatever she had planned next. For now, all I could do was hold my ground and wait for the next move. When my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, I didn't think much of it. After all the fallout from my post, I was used to random messages from relatives or even strangers chiming in with their thoughts. But this one was different. "Hi, this is Sarah, Daniel's daughter. I saw your Facebook post. I think we need to talk." I stared at the screen, confused. Sarah and I barely knew each other. She was my half-sister from Daniel's second marriage, a marriage that had ended almost as disastrously as his brief relationship with my mom. We'd met a handful of times at awkward family events, but we were little more than acquaintances.
Why was she reaching out now?
Curiosity got the better of me.
Hey.
"Sure, what's up?" I typed back. Her response came almost immediately. "Can we meet in person?" "It's about Clara." We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop downtown. I didn't know what to expect, but I wasn't prepared for the woman who walked in. Sarah was a few years older than me, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. She had the same tired look I'd seen in the mirror far too often, like someone who had seen too much and carried it all with her. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, sitting across from me. "I wasn't sure if you'd be interested, but after seeing your post." I couldn't just stay quiet. I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before leaning in closer. "First of all, I'm sorry for everything Clara's put you through. I know we're not close, but I've heard enough over the years to know she's not the easiest person to deal with." "That's putting it mildly," I muttered, taking a sip of my coffee. She offered a small, humorless smile. "Yeah, well, it turns out she's not done yet. She called me a few days ago, out of the blue. I haven't spoken to her in years, but she acted like we were best friends. Said she needed my help." My stomach sank. "What kind of help?" Sarah's expression darkened. "She wanted me to talk to you. To mediate, as she put it. She said you were being unreasonable and that you were punishing her for no reason. She made it sound like you were some spoiled kid throwing a tantrum." I didn't buy it, obviously, but the way she talked, it was manipulative as hell. Hearing this shouldn't have surprised me. Clara had always been a master manipulator, and Sarah's description was textbook Clara. Still, it stung to know she was reaching out to people I barely knew, trying to turn them against me. "What did you say?" I asked, bracing myself. "I told her no," Sarah said firmly. "I said I wasn't going to get involved." But then she got desperate. She started dropping hints about some plan. She had to fix everything. She didn't say much, but it sounded big. Like she was gearing up for something. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did she say what it was?" Sarah shook her head. "No, but the way she talked about you, it wasn't good. She made it sound like you were the villain in some grand story she's telling herself. Like you're the one standing between her and her happy ending." The words hit harder than I expected. Clara's manipulations were nothing new, but the idea that she was planning something bigger, something I couldn't see, was terrifying. "What do you think she's going to do?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Sarah shrugged. "I don't know, but if I were you, I'd be careful. Clara doesn't strike me as someone who gives up easily." For a moment, we sat in silence, the hum of the coffee shop filling the air. Then Sarah leaned forward again, her expression softening. "Look, I know I don't have a right to ask this, but would you mind if we kept in touch? I know what it's like to deal with someone like Clara. I've had my own issues with Daniel, and I just think it helps to have someone who understands." Her words caught me off guard. I hadn't expected this meeting to feel so genuine. I didn't know if I could trust her, but the idea of having someone in my corner, someone who knew what it was like to deal with manipulative parents, was too tempting to ignore. "Yeah," I said finally. "I'd like that." Over the next few days, Sarah and I started piecing things together. She told me more about her own experiences with Daniel, painting a picture that was eerily similar to my own with Clara. Neglect, manipulation, broken promises, it was all too familiar. We also started digging into Clara's recent activities. Sarah had a knack for uncovering information, and together, we found out that Clara had been reaching out to more than just Sarah. She'd contacted several extended family members, spinning the same story about how I was selfish and ungrateful. One relative even sent me a screenshot of a message Clara had sent them. "She doesn't deserve that house," the message read. "She's just a child pretending to be an adult. She needs to learn some responsibility." Seeing those words in black and white was like a punch to the gut. but it also lit a fire in me. I wasn't going to let Clara take away the life I was trying to build for myself. Not again. By the end of the week, Sarah and I had pieced together enough to know one thing for sure. Clara's next move was coming. Whether it was legal action, more public manipulation, or something else entirely, she was gearing up for something big. For the first time in years, though, I didn't feel completely alone. Sarah might not have been the ally I expected, but she was the one I needed. And as the days went on, I realized something else. If Clara was going to try to destroy me, she'd have to go through both of us. I should have seen it coming. With Clara, everything was a game of escalation. When manipulation failed, she didn't stop. She just shifted her tactics. So, when I found a letter in my mailbox with the return address of a local law firm, I wasn't shocked. But the contents still left me reeling. The letter was formal, cold, and to the point. Clara was claiming that she had a legal right to a portion of the house as compensation for raising me. The phrasing was so absurd it almost made me laugh, until the reality of what it meant set in. She was actually trying to take me to court. I immediately called Margaret and Henry. Margaret answered on the second ring, and the moment I told her about the letter, her tone turned sharp. "That woman has no shame," she said. "This is ridiculous. She can't just claim part of your house because she doesn't like that it's yours. Do you think she can win?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Not a chance," Henry said, his voice steady in the background. "We'll help you sort this out. Don't worry." Their reassurance helped, but the stress was overwhelming. Over the next few days, I dug through every document I had related to the house. Margaret and Henry helped me track down the deed, my grandparents' will, and any other paperwork that proved the house was legally mine. Meanwhile, Sarah reached out with her own bit of advice. "Clara thrives on fear," she said during one of our calls. "If she thinks she's rattling you, she'll push harder. Don't give her that satisfaction." The court process, as it turned out, was as laughable as the claim itself. Clara's case had no basis, and her lawyer must have known it, but that didn't stop her from trying. During the hearing, she painted herself as the long-suffering mother who had sacrificed everything for her ungrateful daughter. "She wouldn't even have this house if it weren't for me," Clara said, her voice heavy with fake emotion. "I raised her on my own. I gave her everything I could. And this is how she repays me? By kicking me out and keeping me from the home I deserve." The judge didn't buy it. After reviewing the evidence, they dismissed the case outright. "There is no legal basis for the plaintiff's claim," the judge said, their tone as flat and unimpressed as I'd hoped it would be. Clara's face turned red as she stormed out of the courtroom. Greg, who had been sitting silently in the back, followed her without a word. I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was exhausted. The weeks leading up to the hearing had drained me emotionally and financially, and even though I'd won, the victory felt hollow. Clara wasn't the type to let a loss stop her, and I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. Sure enough, the voicemails started almost immediately. Clara began calling me from blocked numbers, her messages alternating between tearful pleas and furious threats. "You're destroying me," she sobbed in one voicemail. "How could you do this to your own mother? I'm your mother, for God's sake. Don't you feel any guilt at all?" The next message was a complete 180. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you're so clever. But you'll regret this. Mark my words, you'll regret every single thing you've done to me." I stopped listening to the voicemails after that. I blocked every number I could, but somehow, she always found a way to leave another message, her voice a haunting reminder that she wasn't done. One night, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Clara's legal threat had been a desperate move, and while it hadn't worked, it had forced me to confront a painful truth. She wasn't going to change. For years, I'd held on to a small sliver of hope that she might someday see the damage she'd done and try to make amends. But that hope was gone now. Her actions weren't just about the house. They were about control, about maintaining the narrative she'd built for herself. I didn't regret standing my ground. The house was mine, a symbol of the independence I'd fought so hard to achieve. But part of me regretted ever hoping Clara could be anything other than who she was. As I stared at the faint reflection of myself in the darkened window, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, sadness. I didn't know what Clara's next move would be, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of her chaos. It was just another chapter in a battle I hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, one of those rare moments where the world felt calm, and I almost believed things could stay that way. I was in the middle of sorting through a box of old books when I heard the doorbell. The sharp sound startled me. It was rare for anyone to visit without calling first, and after everything with Clara, I'd grown wary of unannounced guests. When I peeked through the window, my stomach dropped. Clara stood on the porch, cradling a newborn baby in her arms. Greg was behind her, leaning against the porch railing with the same smug grin he always wore. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to ignore them, but Clara rang the bell again, this time leaning on it like a child throwing a tantrum. "Open the door," she called, her voice carrying through the glass. "We need to talk." When I opened the door, I kept it only halfway, my body blocking the entrance. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone flat. Clara's eyes lit up with faux warmth, and she held the baby higher, as though presenting a prize. "Meet your little sister," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. I glanced at the baby, a tiny bundle swaddled in a pink blanket, but didn't move closer. "Congratulations," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Now, what do you want?" Her expression shifted, the sweetness evaporating in an instant. "Is that really all you have to say? She's your sister. How can you turn your back on her like this?" I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Turn my back? What are you even talking about?" "You have this whole house to yourself," she said, her voice rising with every word. "Meanwhile, we're struggling to get by. You're her family, and family helps each other. Or have you forgotten that?" I tightened my grip on the door, my patience wearing thin. "We've been over this, Clara. This is my house. If you need a place to stay, figure it out yourself." Greg snorted behind her. "Typical," he muttered, loud enough for me to hear. "Selfish as always." Clara's face twisted in frustration, and she stepped closer, practically shoving the baby into my face. "Look at her," she said, her voice cracking. "She's innocent in all of this. She deserves a better life than what we can give her. Are you really going to let her suffer because of your petty grudge against me?" The audacity of it all left me momentarily speechless. I felt a pang of guilt looking at the baby, not because I owed her anything, but because she was just a pawn in Clara's game. Still, I wasn't going to let that guilt sway me. "Clara," I said, my voice firm, "you need to leave. Now. Or I'll call the police." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might actually back down. But then Greg stepped forward, his body language shifting from smug to menacing. "Really?" he said, his voice low. "You're going to threaten your own mother? That's cold, kid. Real cold." I didn't flinch. "Yeah, I am," I said, meeting his gaze. "Because she's not welcome here. Neither of you are. So, unless you want to explain to the cops why you're trespassing, I suggest you leave." For a moment, none of us moved. Then Clara let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Unbelievable," she muttered, turning on her heel. She stomped down the porch steps, Greg following close behind. As they reached the sidewalk, she turned back to me, her face a mask of fury. "You'll regret this," she called out. "Mark my words. You'll regret it." I didn't respond. I simply closed the door and locked it behind me. That night, I sat in the living room, the baby's face still fresh in my mind. For years, Clara had found ways to guilt and manipulate me, to worm her way into my life no matter how hard I tried to keep her out. And now, she was using a child to do it. It was the final straw. I pulled out my phone and began methodically blocking her on every platform, her number, her email, her social media accounts. I even blocked Greg, just in case he decided to try his hand at intimidation again. It wasn't an easy decision. Cutting her off completely felt final. Even after everything, there was still a small part of me that wanted to believe she could change, that she could someday be the mother I'd always wished for. But that part of me was shrinking, buried under years of pain and disappointment. As I stared at the blank screen of my phone, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, anger, they all swirled together, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I didn't know what Clara's next move would be, but one thing was clear: she would never stop. No matter what I did, no matter how many boundaries I set, she would always find a way to test them. For now, all I could do was take one small step toward reclaiming my life. I didn't know if it would be enough, but it was all I had left. Even after blocking Clara from every corner of my life, she still found ways to linger, like the scent of smoke after a fire. At first, it was in the awkward silences at family gatherings. Whenever I walked into a room, conversations would trail off, and eyes would dart away as though the weight of her actions hung between us like a fog. Margaret and Henry stayed by my side, their loyalty unwavering. They had always seen Clara for who she was, and their support never wavered. But not everyone shared their conviction. Some relatives avoided me altogether, clearly uncomfortable with the public fallout. Others offered quiet words of support in hushed tones, as if afraid Clara might somehow overhear them. "She's a difficult person," one aunt said delicately during a family dinner, avoiding my gaze. "But she's still your mother. Maybe someday." "Someday what?" I snapped, harsher than I intended. "Someday she'll stop trying to ruin my life? Someday she'll apologize? It's not going to happen. She doesn't care about anyone but herself." The conversation ended there, but the resentment I felt toward that aunt, and anyone else still clinging to the idea that Clara was redeemable, lingered long after. Therapy was a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. At first, I was hesitant, unsure of how to open up about years of neglect and manipulation to a stranger. But my therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Hensley, didn't push. She let me unravel the story at my own pace, untangling the knots of anger, guilt, and sadness that Clara had tied in my mind. "Why do you think you held on to hope for so long?" she asked during one session. I hesitated, staring at the floor. "Because she's my mom," I said finally. "You're supposed to have hope for your parents, right? You're supposed to believe they can change." Dr. Hensley nodded thoughtfully.
It's normal to feel that way.
"But it's also important to recognize when that hope is doing more harm than good. Letting go of it doesn't mean you're giving up. It means you're protecting yourself." Her words stuck with me, but the process of letting go was slow. Every time I thought I'd moved on, something would drag me back. A distant cousin would mention Clara in passing. A social media post would pop up with her face in a tagged photo. Each time, the anger bubbled up again, fresh and raw, as though the wounds she'd left behind were being reopened. One evening, I found myself scrolling through social media, mindlessly liking posts from friends and coworkers, when I stumbled upon a picture of Clara. She was at a baby shower, smiling brightly with Greg and their new baby. The caption read, "Such a beautiful family. Clara, you've come so far." I felt a sharp pang of anger, followed by an almost suffocating sadness. She had come so far?
How?
By bulldozing through my life and leaving me to pick up the pieces? By manipulating everyone around her while pretending to be the victim? I closed the app and tossed my phone onto the couch, fighting the urge to scream. It didn't matter how many boundaries I set or how much distance I put between us. Clara still had the power to hurt me, even if it was indirectly. I realized then that moving forward wasn't going to be as simple as cutting her off. The damage she'd caused wasn't just in the past. It had shaped the way I saw the world, the way I trusted or didn't trust people. Therapy was helping, but there were no quick fixes for the scars she'd left behind. In the weeks that followed, I tried to focus on the things I could control. I threw myself into work, started decorating the house in a way that felt uniquely mine, and even adopted a rescue dog named Daisy, a small, scrappy terrier mix who seemed to understand when I needed comfort. Still, the echoes of Clara's actions followed me. Every family gathering, every fleeting mention of her name, every lingering thought about the life I might have had if she'd been different, it all weighed on me. Margaret and Henry reminded me to focus on the progress I'd made. "You've come so far already," Margaret said during one of our weekly phone calls. "Don't let her hold you back anymore. You deserve to be happy." But happiness felt like an elusive goal, something just out of reach. I knew I had to keep pushing forward, to build a life that wasn't defined by Clara's chaos. But the path ahead felt uncertain, and the shadows of her influence loomed large. For now, all I could do was take it one day at a time, hoping that each step forward would bring me closer to the peace I so desperately craved. In the months since cutting Clara out of my life, I've tried to focus on rebuilding, not just my house, but myself. The house has become my sanctuary, a reflection of who I'm trying to be. The creaky floors are now covered in soft rugs, and the walls that once felt empty now hold framed photos, art, and shelves of books. It's not perfect, but it feels like mine in a way nothing ever has before. Reclaiming this space has been therapeutic. I've started pursuing dreams I'd buried for years. Painting, taking online courses, even volunteering at a local animal shelter where I found Daisy. She's become my little shadow, following me from room to room and curling up at my feet when I sit down to work. But no matter how much progress I make, Clara's presence lingers like a shadow I can't fully escape. Sometimes it's in the small things, a name that pops up in conversation, a distant relative who asks if we've made amends, Other times, it's in the quiet moments when doubt creeps in. I'll find myself staring at the door, half expecting her to show up unannounced, her voice full of demands and accusations. It doesn't help that I know she's still out there. I haven't seen her in person since the day she showed up with Greg and the baby, but I've heard enough through the grapevine to know she hasn't let go. A cousin mentioned she was looking into moving closer to her family, a statement that sent chills down my spine. Every now and then, I catch myself wondering, will she try again? Will she ever truly let me go? A part of me, the part that still carries the scars she left, wants to believe she'll change. That she'll wake up one day, realize the damage she's done, and finally make things right. But the realist in me knows better. Clara has always been Clara. Her version of change isn't about growth or reflection. It's about survival, about finding new ways to bend people to her will. For now, I've done everything I can to protect myself. The door to my life is closed, firmly shut against her manipulations, her lies, and her chaos. But it's not locked. It can't be. There's a part of me, buried deep and barely acknowledged, that still struggles with the guilt of closing her out. The voice that says, she's your mother. How can you give up on her completely? It's that voice that keeps the door cracked, that leaves me vulnerable to the possibility of her return. And that's what scares me the most. I don't know if Clara will ever stop trying to claw her way back into my life. I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling the weight of her influence, the echoes of her actions reverberating through everything I do. But I do know this. I'm stronger than I was before. The house that once felt like a battleground now feels like a home. The life she tried to control is finally starting to feel like mine. And no matter what happens next, I'll keep moving forward, one step at a time, one day at a time, until the shadow she cast over me is nothing more than a faint memory. For now, the door remains closed. But whether it stays that way is a question I may never be able to answer.